Hey guys, tonight we are stepping quietly into the misty courtyards of feudal Japan. The sky is a pale, smudged gray, the scent of damp pine clings to your sleeves, and a soft drizzle taps rhythmically against the paper walls of a distant tea house. You might expect to hear the clashing of swords or the barked commands of warriors drilling in formation, but tonight, all you hear are slow footsteps and the whisper of brush on paper. You see, samurai didn't always charge into battle at the first sign of rain. In fact, when the skies darkened, they often set their swords aside and reached instead for their calligraphy brushes. You probably won't survive this reality check if you thought samurai were always out there practicing their sword swings in the mud. Nope. Many of them were more likely perfecting a melancholy poem about wet plum blossoms, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly through the slush of an old temple path, passing by stone lanterns glazed in a fine layer of moss and rainwater. The samurai you imagine, all stern brows and gleaming armor, are not what you meet here. Instead, you come upon a man seated beneath the eaves, legs tucked neatly, writing quietly as rain trickles from his hat. His sword rests beside him, untouched. In feudal Japan, rain didn't just stop battles, it often redirected them entirely into the realm of the poetic. It wasn't simply about getting wet. Rain symbolized transience, patience, and refinement. Samurai, expected to cultivate not just physical strength but also elegance of mind, would sometimes seize upon a rainy day as a perfect excuse to abandon sword drills in favor of composing a few somber lines. Imagine yourself here, squatting uncomfortably in wooden sandals that are probably starting to soak through. The smell of wet earth is thick, the soft patter of rain has the same hypnotic rhythm as the ticking of a clock you forgot to wind. A young samurai, perhaps not much older than you, scribbles furiously about the drooping iris petals before the ink on his brush fades. Mainstream histories often focus on the sword, the katana gleaming heroically in battle. But historians still argue whether that was truly the core of a samurai's daily life. Sure, there were battles, but between wars, which could stretch over years, there were long periods of peace, damp mornings, endless tea ceremonies, and, as we're learning tonight, quite a lot of rain. It turns out that rainy days were not merely weather updates, they were cultural events. Samurai viewed them as gifts of introspection. To write poetry about the rain was to show one's sensitivity, one's ability to observe the fleeting beauty of a droplet sliding down a maple leaf. And yes, somehow, being good at that made you even more respected among your peers. There's a quirky tidbit you might not expect. In some training schools, there were guidelines for how a samurai should admire the rain. It wasn't enough to notice it, you had to feel it, to understand how its presence shaped the garden, the mood, and the perfect time to brew a cup of matcha tea that cooled just as the rain began to taper off. Some masters even suggested that a proper warrior should study the behavior of raindrops on stone to develop patience. The samurai sitting beside you adjusts his brush, careful not to smudge the wet ink. He's probably composing something like, "The rain softens stone, my blade waits beneath the eaves, plum blossoms shiver." There's an odd but lovely balance here. These were men trained to kill, and yet they often obsessed over the sound of rain slipping through pine needles. You might even say the rain was their secret sensei, teaching patience more effectively than 100 grueling sword drills. Of course, not every samurai welcomed the rain. Some, especially those itching for battle or glory, found it intolerable. Imagine standing in your damp armor, itching under layers of wet silk, while your commander insists you spend the day writing couplets instead of sparring. It's understandable if a few grumbled their way through their required verses, much like you might half-heartedly scribble through a school essay you don't care about, but there was little choice. The cultural weight of poetry, particularly on rainy days, was a serious business. To ignore it would be to invite quiet judgment, more cutting than any sword, and besides, battles in the rain were often a terrible idea. Slippery terrain, waterlogged armor, and swords that could quite literally rust if neglected. Better to wait it out. Better to write. It's funny to think that in some of the most prestigious samurai schools, you'd be evaluated not just on your sword grip or your stance, but on whether you could craft a decent seasonal poem, especially about rain. Some schools even kept poetry journals as part of their training logs. Imagine flipping through the records. Student A, excellent parry, poor spring verse. Student B, adequate footwork, stunning winter rain haiku. Historians still debate how much weight poetry actually carried in daily samurai life. Was it a true passion, or just a refined hobby to please superiors? Some argue that the emphasis on poetry was reserved for the higher-ranking samurai, while the lower ranks gritted their teeth and did it because they had to. Others suggest that it permeated all levels of the warrior class, creating a culture where even the gruffest soldier had at least one decent rain poem up his sleeve. As you linger in this courtyard, the drizzle thickens into a gentle shower, and you catch another whiff of damp cedar and faint ink. The young samurai packs away his brush, adjusts his robes, and gives you a nod, not as a rival, but as a fellow observer of rain. You both know there's no battle to rush into today. The rain decides that. Instead, you listen together to the soft percussion of water on bamboo, each drop a reminder that life's fiercest moments can wait. You follow the young samurai along the winding stone paths, his wooden sandals tapping quietly, the rain still murmuring against the tiled rooftops. He moves with an unhurried rhythm, his sword bobbing at his side, not gripped, not drawn, simply there, like an umbrella you carry but rarely open. The truth is, many samurai kept their swords sheathed for long stretches of their lives. When peace settled across Japan, particularly during the Edo period, battles were rare, and swordplay became more ceremonial than practical. In fact, you're wandering into an era where many samurai set their blades on decorative shelves, next to their ink sets and tea bowls. You step into a samurai's study. The scent of ink and tatami mats wrapping around you like a soft blanket. His sword rests high on a polished stand, gleaming, but untouched. He spends most days here, dipping his brush into black ink, carefully practicing the strokes of kanji, each line precise and deliberate. You can almost hear his teacher's voice warning him that a shaky brush hand would reflect poorly on his discipline. The mainstream history books love to show the samurai as battle-hardened warriors, slicing through the air with elegant precision. But historians still argue whether swordsmanship was truly the most critical skill in their daily lives. Sure, they trained, but they also wrote, read, and conducted meticulous studies of the arts. Sword drills were essential, yes, but calligraphy was equally regarded as a reflection of one's soul. One quirky tidbit you pick up as you glance around this quiet room: some samurai schools encouraged writing poetry before a sparring session, believing that calming the mind made for a more effective warrior. Imagine having to pause before a duel to scribble a thoughtful poem about the sound of frogs after rain. You can almost hear a young samurai muttering, "Can't I just swing my sword now?" Your host dips his brush, the ink blooming slowly on the rice paper. He tells you, almost apologetically, that his sword hasn't left its scabbard in months. Rainy seasons stretched endlessly, and battles rarely came knocking. Instead, his mind sharpened on quieter pursuits, on finding just the right word to capture the way raindrops tremble on the edge of a leaf. It wasn't laziness. It was an expectation. Society measured a samurai not only by his sword skills, but also by his composure, his refined taste, and his ability to find depth in the smallest moments. You sit beside him, tracing the elegant brushstrokes with your eyes, realizing that a wobbly line in calligraphy was almost as shameful as clumsy sword work. There's even a famous story about the legendary samurai Miyamoto Musashi. You've probably heard his name whispered with awe in martial arts circles. But here's something people forget: Musashi was not only a master swordsman but also an accomplished painter and poet. He would spend hours practicing ink wash paintings, sumi-e, where the focus was on minimalism, subtle shading, and the soft merging of lines. His brush might capture the fleeting curl of smoke or the soft curve of a leaf, more gently than any battlefield victory. Historians still puzzle over whether Musashi's devotion to the arts was merely a late-life retreat or a central pillar of his identity from the start. Some argue that his poetry and painting were as carefully honed as his two-sword fighting style. Others suggest he turned to them only after tiring of the sword. The debate lingers, much like the drizzle that continues to fall outside this quiet study. Your samurai host gestures to a low shelf where a row of washi paper scrolls lean. He tells you they're filled not with battle records, but with verses written over many rainy seasons. Some are his. Some belong to his father. All speak softly of rain, mist, wind, and waiting. It might surprise you to learn that some samurai swords were rarely, if ever, used. They became status symbols, like a watch you wear but never check, or shoes you display but don't walk in. There are records of samurai who owned exquisitely crafted blades that sat untouched, gathering dust, while their owners pursued tea ceremonies and poetry gatherings. You run your fingers along the lacquered sword stand, the surface smooth and cool. It feels less like a weapon now and more like a relic, a family treasure, a silent reminder of duty that rarely called. One peculiar detail you overhear: some samurai actually commissioned decorative swords specifically for ceremonial wear. These blades were often dull or poorly balanced, not intended for real combat. They were crafted to look splendid while their owners attended poetry contests, seasonal festivals, or political meetings where the pen absolutely outweighed the sword. Your samurai companion waves you outside again, where the rain has softened to a faint drizzle, more mist than storm. He walks with an easy pace, pausing now and then to admire the way raindrops gather on pine needles. You realize that this slow, thoughtful movement is part of his training, too, a careful observation of the world's quiet rhythms. Even during times of war, samurai were expected to cultivate this gentle, introspective side. They were not machines of violence, they were curators of taste, patrons of the arts, and keepers of seasonal awareness. To ignore this was to risk social isolation, or worse, to be labeled coarse, brutish, or uncultured, and so, many samurai gladly shelved their swords when the rain came. It wasn't seen as a failure or a lapse in discipline. It was simply the rhythm of life, a sword for the sun, a brush for the rain. As you walk together beneath the overhanging eaves, the sound of distant laughter drifts over from a nearby tea house. Perhaps another poetry gathering is forming, inspired by the lingering mist and the. You and your samurai companion move quietly along the narrow street, stepping around puddles that reflect the bent trunks of old pine trees. The rain has faded to a faint mist now, like the ghost of a storm. It clings to your sleeves and hair, cool but not unpleasant. The kind of weather that makes you walk slower, whether you mean to or not. The samurai gestures for you to follow him into a nearby inn, where low lanterns flicker and the scent of damp wood, steamed rice, and faint incense wraps around you like a warm, worn blanket. You settle in, feeling the wood creak softly beneath you, as the conversation drifts toward the peculiar daily routines of these warriors who seem more poet than soldier. You might expect that a samurai's day would be filled with endless sword drills and grueling martial training from dawn till dusk. But historians still argue whether this was truly the case for most samurai, especially in the more peaceful stretches of Japanese history. Yes, they trained, but not as relentlessly as the modern action movies would have you believe. Instead, the typical day of a samurai was often divided between formal obligations, studying, writing, and yes, copious amounts of sitting around waiting for something, anything, to happen. And on rainy days, the rhythm slowed even further. You watch as the samurai pulls out a thin, thread-bound notebook from his sleeve, his poetry journal. He flips through the pages, pointing out verses written by friends, mentors, and even a rival or two. Each poem is a tiny snapshot of a rainy moment. He seems to take a quiet pride in his collection, more so than if he were showing off battle scars. There's a curious practice you stumble across. Some samurai would compose linked verse poetry called renga with their fellow warriors during long rains. Imagine that, a group of fierce swordsmen huddled under the same roof, passing brush and paper back and forth, each adding a stanza, building a poem together as the rain tapped steadily on the wooden beams above. Sometimes these sessions would stretch for hours, even days, as the rain continued to pour. It became a gentle competition, but also a shared meditation. You might have thought that a samurai's rivalries were settled with duels, but just as often they were settled with the elegance of a rain-soaked verse. Historians still debate whether these poetry sessions were formal training or simply a way to pass the soggy afternoons. Some records suggest that poetic skill could boost your social standing, while others argue it was just a quiet expectation, like keeping your sandals neatly aligned at the doorway. Your samurai companion sips his tea and explains, in a soft tone, that a warrior's ability to appreciate the subtle sounds of rain was seen as a reflection of his sensitivity to life's impermanence, mono no aware, as they called it. The aching beauty of things that vanish. The plum blossoms that fall, the rain that fades, the battles that never come. You take another sip of tea, its warmth blooming in your chest, and realize that the samurai were not simply training for war. They were training to notice the world as it slipped by. A quirky tidbit you learn: in some samurai schools, students were required to carry small notebooks to jot down poetic thoughts whenever inspiration struck, even in the middle of sword practice. There are scattered accounts of warriors pausing mid-drill to scrawl a quick haiku about a shifting cloud or a sudden breeze, before returning to their forms. You imagine how that would go over in a modern gym, someone dropping their dumbbells mid-set to write a poem about the air conditioning. But for samurai, this blending of the martial and the poetic was not only accepted, it was essential. Your host recounts tales of legendary poetry gatherings hosted by daimyo, powerful feudal lords, where high-ranking samurai were expected to contribute their own verses. To be invited to such a gathering was an honor. To present a clumsy or uninspired poem was, well, perhaps not fatal, but certainly humiliating. Some historians argue that these poetic expectations were actually a form of soft power, a way for the ruling class to cultivate obedience and refinement. Ensuring their warriors were not only loyal but also cultured, introspective, and less likely to erupt into senseless violence. You glance out the window where the rain begins to pick up again, blurring the edges of the street, softening the sharp lines of the world. The samurai seems content to sit with the quiet, tapping his brush against the edge of the inkstone. He tells you of an old teaching, that the rain, much like the sword, requires patience. You cannot hurry it. You cannot force it to stop or start. You simply wait, observing its rhythm, moving with it rather than against it. There's something oddly comforting in that. You start to realize that the rain was not a nuisance to the samurai, it was a teacher. And on days like this, it taught stillness. You remember hearing about how samurai were trained to be always alert, always ready to draw their sword at a moment's notice. But in the rain, that tension dissolved. Wet sword grips, slippery footing, and soaked armor made quick draws impractical, even dangerous. The rain granted a rare permission, to set down the blade, to sit, to write, to wait. One peculiar custom your companion mentions: in some regions, it was considered extremely poor form to challenge or accept a duel in heavy rain. Partly for safety, but also because the rain was viewed as a moment for reflection, not conflict. Challenging someone during a downpour was seen as both uncultured and, frankly, just bad manners. You sip the last of your tea as the samurai slides a fresh sheet of rice paper toward you, raising an eyebrow as if to say, "Your turn now." You're not a poet, but somehow, it feels right to try, perhaps something simple, like, "The rain drums softly, even the sword leans away, waiting for springtime." Your samurai friend reads it, nods slowly, and adds his own stanza, linking his words to yours. Just like that, you're part of a centuries-old rhythm, one where poetry and rain wove through the quiet lives of those we so often remember only as warriors. The rain continues to fall, not asking for battles, not demanding swordplay, just gently reminding you to slow down. You and your samurai companion step back out into the quiet streets, your footsteps softened by the wet earth beneath. The rain lingers, more a companion now than a hindrance. As you walk side by side, your thoughts circle back to the sword, a symbol so tightly bound to the samurai's identity, yet, it seems, often at rest. Your friend taps the hilt of his sword lightly with his fingers, not in readiness, but out of habit. He tells you, almost with a chuckle, that while the sword was his badge, his brush was his daily companion. For many samurai, writing poetry wasn't just encouraged, it was a necessary expression of discipline and refinement. Yet, here's the strange part, even their poetry was sometimes more scrutinized than their swordsmanship. Historians still puzzle over this. Did the samurai truly fear social disgrace more than death on the battlefield? Some argue that, in peaceful times, the pen, or in this case, the brush, was the more dangerous weapon. A clumsy verse at a poetry gathering could slice through a samurai's reputation faster than a rival's blade. As you stroll past wooden houses with gently sagging roofs, your companion tells you about these gatherings, udakai, poetry contests where samurai would recite their work, often themed around the rain, the seasons, or fleeting beauty. The audiences, usually composed of lords, scholars, and other warriors, would listen intently, judging not only the craft of the poem but also the sensitivity of the poet. There's a peculiar tidbit you pick up: samurai were sometimes trained to match their poetic tone to the weather. A bright, sunny day called for verses that soared, light and playful, while a rainy afternoon like this demanded softness, a quiet ache, a patient rhythm. You pass a small shop where an elderly man is carefully oiling sword hilts and straightening displays. Your samurai pauses and explains that sword maintenance was a form of meditation. Even when a blade sat idle, it required care, regular polishing, oiling, and respectful handling. It was less about the edge and more about the discipline, much like the careful shaping of a haiku. But here's where things get even more curious: some samurai didn't personally maintain their swords. They hired specialists called togashi to keep the blades in perfect condition, while they themselves focused on poetry, tea ceremonies, or garden design. Imagine a warrior outsourcing his sword care to free up more time to perfect the placement of moss around his koi pond. Historians still debate whether this was common practice or just a quirk among the upper classes. Some claim that true samurai would never let another man polish their blade. Others point to records showing that sword maintenance became so specialized it practically birthed its own profession, with togashi sometimes regarded with more reverence than the swordsmen themselves. You and your companion duck under a wide eave as another gentle wave of rain passes overhead. He speaks of the byukbunka, or samurai culture, that prized artistic pursuits like ikebana, the artful arrangement of flowers, as much as battlefield tactics. In fact, some daimyo required their samurai to study flower arranging to sharpen their aesthetic sensibilities. You imagine a gruff, battle-scarred warrior delicately pinching the stem of a chrysanthemum, his fingers stained with ink instead of blood. There's a well-known story your companion shares, one that always seems to surface in these quiet conversations. It's about the samurai Hosokawa Yusai, a poet and warrior who famously survived political upheavals thanks, in part, to his reputation as a master of waka poetry. When Yusai faced siege in his old age, it's said that his poetic standing earned him unexpected respect, even among his would-be attackers, who eventually spared him out of admiration for his literary contributions. Historians still argue whether this story is more legend than fact, but the sentiment lingers. Poetry could, in its own subtle way, save a life. You find it oddly soothing, this balance between martial readiness and artistic sensitivity. The samurai weren't just trained to fight, they were trained to perceive beauty, to honor transience, to find grace in the sound of rain slipping from one leaf to another. Your friend leads you into a small, walled garden tucked behind an old tea house. The garden is not grand, but it's clearly tended with care, stone paths, carefully pruned trees, and a single bench facing a bamboo grove. The air is rich with the scent of wet earth and green leaves. He sits and motions for you to do the same. This, he says quietly, is sword practice too. You watch the raindrops pool on a flat stone, merging slowly before tumbling over the edge. You hear the faint drip of water from the eaves. The rustle of leaves in the misty air. There's no urgency here. No opponent waiting to strike. Just the slow, deliberate act of paying attention. One curious footnote drifts into your thoughts. Samurai poetry about rain wasn't just metaphorical or symbolic, it often contained incredibly precise, sensory details. The specific sound of rain on lacquered armor, the way damp silk clung to the skin, the subtle differences between summer showers and autumn drizzles. The rain wasn't just a mood, it was a studied, familiar presence. Your companion recites a fragment of a poem, his voice low and steady. Rain seeps through the pine, my sword untouched today, ink dries slower. You sit together in comfortable silence, watching the rain soften the world's edges. Historians still discuss whether this era's peace dulled the warrior's edge or sharpened it in quieter ways. Perhaps these long stretches of rain-soaked reflection trained a different kind of readiness, a calm, precise attention to life's smallest shifts. The samurai smiles faintly, as if to confirm what you're starting to understand. The rain was not an interruption of his training, it was the training. You listen to the steady rhythm of the rain, feeling its quiet weight settle into your bones, and you begin to suspect that there's something profoundly restful in this ancient pace of life, a pace that asks you not to rush, not to fight, but simply to notice. The rain tapers again, settling into a soft mist that beads gently on your sleeves. You and your samurai companion linger in the quiet garden, both content to let time pass without resistance. There's no rush, no urgent summons, just the low rustling of bamboo leaves and the faint patter of droplets finding their way from branch to earth. Your friend shifts his gaze to a small, stone lantern, its mossy surface glistening in the damp air. Rain, he muses, teaches us to stay still. The sword teaches us the same. It's tempting to think that swordsmanship was always about speed, quick draws, sharp counters, lightning-fast reflexes. But here's the curious truth, many samurai schools emphasized patience over speed. They taught that a delayed strike, a perfectly timed pause, could win a duel more decisively than a flurry of attacks. Historians still argue whether this focus on calm, poised waiting was a natural evolution of the samurai code or simply a reflection of their long, uneventful postings during peaceful eras. Either way, the lessons of the sword and the lessons of the rain seem to move in quiet harmony. You follow your companion through the winding garden paths, careful not to disturb the puddles left behind. He tells you of an old training exercise, to sit perfectly still, for hours if needed, observing the smallest changes in the surroundings. The flicker of a leaf, the shift of a shadow. The exact moment a raindrop falls from a branch. Some schools believed this stillness was the foundation of both poetry and swordsmanship. There's a quirky tidbit you pick up. Some dojos trained their students to listen to the rain while blindfolded, sharpening their sense of space and timing through sound alone. Imagine that, warriors crouched silently in their practice halls, eyes covered, attuning themselves not to the clash of swords but to the rhythm of falling rain. You pause under a wooden gate, where the beams still drip from the earlier downpour. Your friend explains that these sound-based exercises weren't just about building patience, they were about cultivating presence. A good swordsman, much like a good poet, couldn't afford to let his mind wander. You had to be fully inside each moment, even the quiet ones. He taps his calloused fingers against his scabbard and shares a story about the legendary swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, whose duels were famous for their deliberate slowness. Musashi would often arrive late to his own fights, strolling casually, forcing his opponents to stew in their own tension. He believed that waiting could be its own weapon. Historians still debate whether Musashi's penchant for delay was strategic genius or simply the privilege of a man so confident that he didn't feel rushed by death. Either way, the tactic worked. His rivals often exhausted themselves mentally before the first blow was even struck. You pass a weathered shrine where the stone steps glisten with fresh rain. The air is cool and still, the kind of quiet that invites your breathing to slow without you even noticing. Your companion tells you that in some sword schools, rainy days were designated for polishing, not just the sword's blade, but the mind's edge as well. There's something beautifully cyclical about it. The rain keeps you inside. The inside keeps you still. The stillness brings you closer to noticing the world as it is, not as you expect it to be. You trail your fingers along the wooden railing, feeling the slight roughness where the lacquer has worn thin. Your friend recounts another peculiar custom. Some samurai carried netsuke, small, intricately carved toggles, that often depicted natural scenes like raindrops on leaves or frogs by ponds. These were not mere decorations, they were tiny reminders to carry beauty with them, even in the most mundane moments. You realize that for all the samurai's reputation as stoic warriors, their daily lives were interwoven with symbols of softness and impermanence. The falling rain, the wilting flowers, the passing clouds, each one a nudge to remember how little we can hold on to. As you continue your slow walk, your companion shares a haiku from Basho, the poet often revered by samurai and commoners alike. Spring rain leaking through the roof, enough to wet a lone paper thread. The image settles in your mind, delicate and precise. It's not about grand battles or fierce storms. It's about the quiet inconvenience of a slow drip. Yet somehow, it feels monumental. Your samurai guide points out that the rain didn't merely delay practice, it transformed it. A wet practice yard forced students indoors, where they'd rehearse their forms more deliberately, without the distractions of wind or uneven ground. Some teachers even claim that rainy day training sharpened a warrior's internal balance more than any outdoor sparring session. Historians still discuss whether this internal focus created a generation of overly cautious swordsmen or if it bred a deeper, more measured mastery. Either way, it's clear that the rain shaped their training just as surely as their teachers did. You pass by a cluster of wooden geta, elevated sandals, left neatly outside a doorway. Your companion tells you, with a wry smile, that the sound of geta clacking against the stone was once used to tell time in small villages. On rainy days, when few people ventured out, the silence itself marked the passage of hours. It's a charming thought, that absence of sound could be as telling as its presence. That waiting in the rain wasn't an empty pause, but a kind of practice in itself. You find yourself walking slower now, your senses more attuned to the soft textures of the world around you. The damp wood beneath your feet, the delicate scent of moss, the way the mist curls around the temple eaves. The rain, persistent yet gentle, wraps around you like a cool shawl as you and your samurai companion step onto a narrow bridge arching over a quiet koi pond. The fish, plump and slow-moving, drift just below the surface, their mouths occasionally breaking the water in lazy circles. Your companion pauses, resting his hands on the damp railing, his gaze distant. He begins to tell you about the strange relationship between samurai and water. You might expect tales of shipbuilding or naval battles, but no, what the samurai truly admired was the rain's patience, its refusal to rush, its ability to shape mountains over time. Historians still debate whether this water-centric philosophy stemmed from practical military strategies or from deeper spiritual underpinnings tied to Zen Buddhism. Some claim the focus on flowing water was part of the samurai's mental training, teaching them to be adaptable yet unyielding, while others argue it was more about daily proximity to rivers, moats, and Japan's famously wet climate. Your friend taps his scabbard lightly again, his way of inviting you further into the story. He explains that many samurai wrote poems about rain not as a casual pastime, but as a disciplined exercise in mushin, a state of no mind, of pure presence, where the ego dissolves, and one simply responds to the moment. Curiously, even the construction of their castles reflected this watery reverence. You pass by the outer walls of a fortress now, noting how the rain slides down the steep, carefully angled stones. Your companion points out that these sloping walls, called mushigashi, not only repelled invaders but also managed rainwater with extraordinary efficiency. The design, it seems, kept both enemies and puddles at bay. He tells you that many samurai saw the rain as a quiet partner in life, a teacher that never raised its voice but wore down obstacles with steady insistence. It's an oddly comforting thought, especially as you listen to the soft plunk of raindrops landing on the pond's broad lotus leaves. You wander past a row of tall cedar trees, their trunks darkened to near black by the wet. Your friend recounts a curious bit of cultural trivia. In some samurai households, there were designated rain poems ready to be recited when guests arrived during a storm. Not reciting one would have been considered a social misstep, a missed opportunity to display cultured refinement. Historians still debate whether this etiquette was widely practiced or reserved for elite warrior poets. But it paints a picture of a world where even the weather had its own conversational script. Your companion suddenly stops near a small wooden pavilion and gestures toward a pile of smooth stones carefully stacked at its base. He tells you about sukawari, an old summer pastime where participants, often blindfolded, attempted to split a watermelon with a wooden stick. It seems far removed from the gravity of samurai life, but your friend insists the game was occasionally used as a playful way to train reflexes and spatial awareness. Rainy days, he says with a wink, made the game much harder, and much funnier. The image lingers, warriors, serious and stoic, swaying unsteadily under blindfolds, swinging sticks at watermelons while their friends stifled laughter in the drizzle. You both settle into the pavilion, letting the rain become the loudest sound again. Your companion quietly shares a poem passed down among sword schools, its author unknown. Blade sheathed in rain, strikes not out of hunger, but patience sharpened. He taps his fingers on the wooden floor, a soft rhythm matching the droplets that echo around you. Most people, he says, think samurai were always hunting the next duel. But a real swordsman learned to enjoy the waiting. You think back to those long, tense duels often romanticized in plays and films. It's easy to imagine them as quick flashes of violence, but more often, they were slow dances, opponents circling, waiting, watching, sometimes for hours. Rain, it seems, was a fitting companion to this drawn-out anticipation. Historians still argue whether the most famous duels were truly battles of skill or contests of patience. Some suggest that many victories came not from superior swordsmanship, But from wearing down an opponent's nerve during these prolonged standoffs, your companion leans back, folding his arms comfortably as he watches the koi stir the pond's surface. He tells you about Satori, the sudden flash of enlightenment sought in Zen practice. For some samurai, it came not on the battlefield, but in moments like this, watching the rain, reciting a poem, noticing the slight tilt of a leaf, you begin to notice how the rain smooths the world's rough edges. The pebbled paths gleam like glass. The wooden beams seem warmer, their grain more visible. Even the smallest sound, the distant creak of a garden gate, feels more vivid in the hush that rain creates. Your companion gestures toward a distant umbrella bobbing along the path. The rain slows everyone down, he murmurs. Even the hurried ones. There's another peculiar tidbit he shares: some samurai deliberately walked slowly in the rain, letting themselves be drenched as a test of stoicism. The practice wasn't about toughness, but about dissolving irritation, letting discomfort pass through them like water through a sieve. The modern equivalent, perhaps, of walking barefoot on gravel just to remind yourself that it's okay to feel things and keep moving. Historians still debate whether these rain-soaked walks were serious training or eccentric habits passed off as discipline. Either way, they offer a glimpse into a mindset where even inconvenience became a form of quiet practice. Your companion rises, brushing stray drops from his sleeves. It's easy to chase after grand victories, he says softly. But the rain teaches us to stay with the small, steady things. You walk together again, the rhythm of your steps syncing with the steady drizzle. The world has softened, blurred at the edges, like an ink painting left out in the weather. And somehow, you don't mind at all. The rain becomes almost a memory now, a fine mist lingering more in the air than on your skin. You and your samurai companion wander past low stone walls slick with moss, moving toward a row of wooden homes with their latticed windows barely aglow in the soft afternoon light. As you walk, he begins to speak of the odd rhythms of samurai daily life, how, for all their dedication to swordsmanship, much of their time was spent in administration, letter writing, and, surprisingly often, sitting and waiting. Historians still argue whether the image of the always-ready warrior is more legend than reality. Many samurai, especially during the long peace of the Edo period, were as much bureaucrats as they were fighters. They copied scrolls, recorded village rice taxes, and managed the intricate dance of social hierarchy. Your companion chuckles as he describes the quiet battles fought not with blades, but with calligraphy brushes and inkstones. There was fierce pride in having the neatest handwriting, in crafting the most elegant seasonal greeting. Rainy days, it turns out, were perfect for such work. The damp air softened the ink, made the brush strokes glide with subtle resistance, adding a kind of depth to each character. There's a peculiar tidbit here: some samurai purposely left the final brush stroke of a letter unfinished if interrupted by a visitor or a change in weather. This incomplete mark, called hikizome, signaled that life had stepped in and that the flow of the moment was more important than rigid perfection. You pause at a tea house where the smell of roasted barley drifts from within, mingling with the sweet petrichor rising from the wet earth. Your friend explains that tea was more than just a beverage. It was a daily ceremony of slowness, a deliberate pause wrapped in precise, graceful motions. Samurai often practiced the tea ritual to temper their instincts, to soften the rough edges sharpened by martial training. Historians still debate whether samurai truly embraced the tea ceremony for its philosophical lessons or if it simply became a status marker, another layer of social performance. Perhaps, like many things, it was a little of both. As you sip the light, nutty brew together, your companion recounts a soft, almost comic detail. Sometimes tea gatherings became competitions, not of who could brew the finest cup, but who could maintain the calmest, most unshakable demeanor while doing so. Imagine fierce warriors sweating under the pressure of properly folding a tea cloth while a roomful of peers watched in silent judgment. It's all rather endearing. You wander again, the streets now dappled with tiny puddles. Your friend shares a story about samurai umbrellas, carefully crafted with oiled paper and bamboo spokes. There was an almost theatrical etiquette to their use. One must never raise the umbrella too hastily, as it could signal panic, nor let it collapse too quickly, as that might suggest impatience. Even in rain, poise was everything. You notice that many of the wooden houses along your path have deep overhangs to shield passers-by. These thoughtful architectural gestures seem to nod toward the rain as an expected, welcomed guest rather than a nuisance to avoid. There's something soothing in this willingness to build life around the rain, to accommodate it, to find in it not disruption, but rhythm. Your companion stops at a narrow alley where ivy climbs greedily up the walls. He tells you that in some regions, rain festivals celebrated not the storm's ferocity, but its gentle persistence. Villagers would craft simple paper charms, set them afloat in streams, and let the rain carry their quiet wishes along. Historians still argue whether samurai genuinely participated in these local rain rituals or merely observed from the margins. But records suggest that many did, perhaps finding in these simple acts a connection to something beyond their social station, a brief escape from the demands of rank and duty. You trail your fingers along the ivy's slick leaves, thinking of those paper charms, their ink blurring as they drifted away. Your companion tells you about makuso, a silent meditation often performed before and after sword practice. On rainy days, the sound of the drizzle served as a natural metronome, guiding the breath into slower, steadier rhythms. Some samurai reportedly trained themselves to inhale only between raindrops landing on nearby stones. Forcing their minds to settle into the tiniest pockets of waiting, it's a peculiar detail that lingers with you. The rain wasn't merely background noise, it was a partner in their training, a living element in their discipline. You pass by a stack of wooden buckets left outside a bathhouse, their surfaces beaded with raindrops. Your companion explains that bathhouses were social hubs, places where samurai of all ranks could soak and, if they chose, set aside the strictures of hierarchy for a little while. Bathhouses, like the rain, leveled everyone. Nobody looked impressive dripping wet. He adds, with a sly grin, that some samurai practiced the art of small talk there, not just idle chatter, but carefully measured exchanges designed to reveal little while appearing friendly. Even conversation was a quiet dance. You glance up as the rain resumes its steady tapping, the sky sagging in soft gray folds above you. Your companion's footsteps slow, his voice nearly blending with the rain. You see, he says, the sword teaches us to wait. The rain teaches us to stay. The rain has settled now into a steady, familiar rhythm, soft enough to blend into the background, yet constant enough to keep you wrapped in its quiet company. You and your samurai guide step off the stone path and into a wide, open courtyard where the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke hangs low in the air. Here, your companion begins to tell you about the hidden layers of samurai education, far beyond swords and battle formations. You might expect endless drilling, but much of their training involved storytelling, poetry, and the careful study of nature's rhythms, especially the rain. Historians still argue whether these softer disciplines were truly considered as valuable as combat skills or whether they were simply polite distractions during peacetime. But across diaries, letters, and family scrolls, it becomes clear that many samurai believed that writing about the rain was as essential as learning to wield a blade. Your friend explains that composing poetry about rain wasn't merely a leisurely activity, it was often assigned as homework, a quiet test of one's ability to observe the world without interference from ego or ambition. Some samurai schools required students to write poems before picking up a sword, as if to remind them that sensitivity and violence had to be kept in balance. There's an oddly charming tidbit here. in some dojos, if a student's rain poem was considered especially insightful, they might be excused from physical training for the day. Imagine getting out of sparring practice simply because you perfectly captured the melancholy of drizzle on a persimmon leaf. You pass by a row of small stone statues, their mossy heads bowed slightly under the weight of raindrops. Your companion tells you about Jizo, guardian figures believed to protect travelers and children. On rainy days, people would often place tiny hats or red bibs on these statues, both to honor them and to keep them dry, a gesture of care toward the protectors who never moved. Historians still debate whether samurai truly participated in these small, almost domestic rituals, or whether they were considered beneath their station. Yet there are scattered records of warriors pausing to adjust a Jizo's hat, or leaving offerings of rice on a rainy day. Even the fiercest fighters, it seems, could not resist a quiet moment of tenderness toward stone guardians. Your friend points to a covered veranda where two elderly men sit, their swords propped casually against the wall, their conversation slow and fragmented. He tells you about monogoto wabi, the art of finding satisfaction in small, incomplete things, a chipped tea bowl, a half-remembered song, or the imperfection of a rain-drenched afternoon. It was not only acceptable to enjoy these imperfect moments, it was considered a kind of wisdom. Historians still argue whether this philosophy was genuinely widespread among samurai or merely the indulgence of retired warriors with time to spare. Either way, the practice of embracing what is incomplete seems woven into the way they observe the rain. Your companion taps his wooden sandals against the wet stone floor, each step producing a soft clack, and tells you about an old rain game. Samurai children would fold paper boats and race them down the narrow gutters alongside the streets, betting small trinkets on whose boat would arrive first at the garden pond. Even full-grown warriors were known to linger and watch the tiny boats, cheering silently as the water carried them along. There's something gently comical about it, men trained for war quietly rooting for a soggy paper vessel, utterly absorbed in its wobbly, meandering journey. You cross a small arched bridge, the wood slick and dark beneath your feet, and your companion points out that bridges themselves often appeared in samurai rain poetry, not just as scenery but as metaphors for transition, waiting, and the spaces between decisions. The bridge in the rain is a place where you can't go quickly, it forces you to slow down, to hear the rain patter against the wood, to feel the dampness settle into your sleeves. As you walk, your friend shares an old saying, even 1,000 raindrops begin with one cloud. It's the samurai's gentle way of reminding themselves that all things, even the grandest victories or the deepest sorrows, start from something small, often something unnoticed. Historians still debate whether this saying was popular among all warrior ranks or only among the more philosophically inclined elite. Still, it paints a quiet picture of men who, despite their hardened image, deeply respected the incremental, the small changes, the soft steps. Your companion leads you toward a quiet garden where a stone lantern leans slightly, its base swallowed by creeping moss. He tells you that in some samurai households, it was considered bad form to replace a mossy lantern simply because it had become crooked or worn. The lean was part of its story, part of the slow erosion that the rain had written upon it. You crouched near the lantern, noticing the fine sheen of rain still coating its surface. In this way, the rain isn't just a weather pattern, it's a quiet sculptor, gently reshaping the world one drop at a time. There's another peculiar practice your friend mentions. Some samurai, when traveling on foot during rain, would deliberately avoid the largest stepping stones and instead walk directly through puddles. The idea was to cultivate resilience, to accept discomfort without complaint, and to remind themselves that speed was not always the goal. Sometimes, getting wet was simply the correct thing to do. Historians still argue whether this puddle-walking custom was truly a widespread samurai habit or a quirk embraced by only a few eccentric warriors. Either way, it feels perfectly in tune with their gentle acceptance of the rain's slow insistence. your companion's voice softens as he recounts one final story for this moment, a tale of an aging samurai who, rather than seeking grand battles, spent his final years writing haiku about the rhythm of raindrops falling on his thatched roof. His students expected him to pass on secret sword techniques, but instead, his final teaching was this: watch the rain. It knows what it's doing. You both stand quietly now, letting the soft hush of the rain fill the space between your breaths, and perhaps you begin to understand that the rain was never the distraction, it was always the lesson. The rain's rhythm seems to deepen as you continue your journey, wrapping the world in a soft, steady pulse. You find yourself stepping into a narrow lane lined with tall bamboo, each stalk bowed gently beneath the weight of tiny droplets. The sound is a delicate percussion, the tap of rain on leaves blending with the whisper of a cool breeze. Your samurai companion pauses to share the story of the kesa, the distinctive sleeveless robe worn by monks and some samurai during meditation or travel. On rainy days, the kesa could become heavy and cold, but it was always worn with a sense of quiet pride. It reminded the wearer that discomfort was a teacher, not a punishment. There's a curious detail here: some samurai would tie small bells to their robes to mark their passage quietly through the bamboo. The soft ringing blending with the rain's melody. These bells, though gentle, served as a subtle alert, reminding the wearer to move with mindfulness and care. Historians still debate whether these bells were primarily practical tools or more symbolic, part of a ritualized awareness practice. Either way, the sound created a kind of harmony with the rain, a gentle musical thread connecting human movement to nature's rhythm. As you walk, you notice the occasional shimmer of suzu beads hanging from rooftops and gates. These tiny, bell-like ornaments were believed to ward off evil spirits, especially during rainy weather when the boundary between the human world and the supernatural felt thinner. Your companion smiles softly as he explains that the tinkling sound of suzu was considered both protective and soothing, like nature's own lullaby. You step closer to a small shrine tucked beneath a canopy of maple trees, their leaves dripping steadily. Your guide explains that many samurai maintained personal altars where they would offer prayers and small tokens to gods of water and rain, acknowledging the vital role rain played in the survival of crops and the rhythms of daily life. There's an intriguing side note: during heavy rains, some samurai families would hold quiet ceremonies asking the water gods not to flood, but to keep the steady flow that nourished rice fields. It was an early form of ecological mindfulness, wrapped in spiritual practice. Historians still debate whether such rituals were common across all regions or unique to certain clans with closer ties to agricultural communities. But the fact remains that rain, in many forms, was deeply woven into samurai's spirituality. Your companion then tells you about the unusual practice of kirai, the art of paper cutting, which some samurai enjoyed during rainy afternoons indoors. The intricate patterns often depicted water, clouds, or rain itself, fragile, delicate designs that capture the essence of transient beauty. You imagine the scissors moving slowly, carefully through thin paper, much like raindrops tracing their slow path down a windowpane. It's a quiet reminder that art was not just decoration but a way to honor the fleeting moments shaped by nature. As the rain lightens to a soft drizzle, your companion describes a popular folk tale that some samurai told their children: the story of the rain dragon. A mystical creature said to live in the clouds, controlling the rain's arrival and departure. The dragon was neither feared nor worshipped but seen as a playful spirit, sometimes moody, sometimes generous, much like the rain itself. Historians still argue whether this tale was truly widespread or a local legend, but it illustrates how samurai culture embraced natural phenomena not only with practicality but also imagination. You follow your companion to a small wooden bridge arching over a koi pond, where the raindrops ripple softly across the water's surface. Watching the fish glide beneath the surface, you feel a deep sense of calm. The pond reflects the overcast sky, the edges blurred by the persistent mist, He explains that koi ponds were carefully designed to catch rainwater, symbolizing both patience and endurance, qualities every samurai needed, whether on the battlefield or in daily life. The slow, deliberate movement of koi fish under the rain became a living metaphor for the warrior's path. You settle quietly beside the pond, feeling the gentle cold seep into your bones, and your companion shares one last thought for this moment. The samurai's rain poems often ended not with grand declarations, but with simple observations: a fallen leaf, the sound of a distant temple bell, the coolness of wet stone. It's these small, hushed details that carry the weight of their world. You breathe in the cool, rain-scented air, and you feel, just for a moment, the edges of your own busy life soften, replaced by something slower, gentler, and patiently enduring. The rain has shifted again, becoming a lighter mist that clings to your skin like a delicate veil. You follow your samurai companion through a narrow garden path bordered by moss-covered stones, each one slick and cool beneath your feet. The air is thick with the earthy scent of wet leaves and the faint perfume of blooming plum trees. Your guide begins to tell you about the role of rain in samurai gardens, which were designed not only for beauty but for contemplation. Unlike the more formal gardens of courtiers, samurai gardens often featured elements that changed subtly with the weather: ponds that filled with rainwater, stones that glistened in the drizzle, and plants that thrived in dampness. Historians still debate whether samurai themselves designed these gardens or if the work was left to specialized gardeners. But the important thing is that the gardens were living poems, spaces where the rain could write its own verses on stone and leaf. There's a quirky fact here: some samurai believed that the sound of rain hitting the garden's bamboo fences was a form of secret communication, messages from nature that only the trained ear could decipher. Imagine sitting quietly, listening to that rhythm, trying to catch hidden meanings in the gentle taps. As you walk, your companion points out a stone basin carved into the shape of a turtle, called a tsukubai, used in tea ceremonies to rinse hands. On rainy days, it would fill naturally with water, its surface shimmering with falling droplets. The sight was said to remind samurai of humility: the turtle's slow, steady pace, the cleansing water, and the quiet acceptance of nature's gifts. Your guide mentions that rain was often featured in the poetry shared during tea ceremonies. The tea master might compose a short verse about the rain's sound on the veranda or the coolness it brought to the garden air, weaving the moment into the ceremony's mood. There's an amusing detail about samurai tea gatherings on rainy days. Guests would sometimes compete quietly to see who could compose the most melancholic rain poem, each trying not to smile as they delivered their verses. The result was a kind of gentle rivalry, a test of wit wrapped in calmness. Historians still argue whether such competitions were formalized or simply passed down as informal stories among the warrior class. Regardless, they highlight the importance of poetry and rain in samurai social life. Your companion gestures toward a narrow wooden pavilion overlooking the garden pond, where rainwater drips rhythmically from the eaves. He tells you about the soundscape samurai appreciated: how rain, wind, and water features created a natural symphony that encouraged mindfulness and presence. You sit quietly, letting the soft patter fill your senses, and he shares a saying: the sound of rain teaches patience. There's a subtle humor in how this translates to samurai life. After all, patience was often the hardest skill to master, especially for those trained in the art of swift action. But the rain had its own pace, reminding warriors that not every moment demanded speed. As you rise, your companion leads you to a small alcove where an inkstone and brush rest beside a soaked scroll. He explains that many samurai used rainy afternoons to practice calligraphy, finding inspiration in the shifting gray light and the endless flow of water. There's a charming detail about the ink. Samurai sometimes added drops of rainwater to their ink to dilute it slightly, creating softer, more fluid strokes. Much like the rain itself, historians still debate whether this practice was widespread or a later artistic invention, but it fits perfectly with the samurai's blending of art and nature. You watch as your companion dips the brush into the ink and begins to write a simple haiku, each stroke deliberate and flowing, like the rain dripping from the roof. The poem speaks softly of falling leaves, gentle rain, and the quiet passage of time, themes you've come to recognize as the heart of samurai rain poetry. The rain slows again, the garden lightning as clouds break apart, and you feel a gentle calm settling in your chest, as if the rain has washed away more than just dust and heat. You breathe deeply, the scent of wet earth and moss filling your lungs, and you realize that the rain is no longer just weather, it's a companion on your journey. The sky has begun to lighten, the rain tapering into a fine, misty drizzle that clings to the air like a whispered secret. You and your samurai companion step away from the garden and into the softly illuminated halls of a traditional house, where the scent of tatami mats mingles with the lingering freshness of rain. The wood floor beneath your feet is still cool and slightly damp, and somewhere nearby, water droplets patter against paper shoji screens. Your companion gestures toward a low writing desk and tells you about the significance of rain in samurai literature, not just poetry but in the longer narratives and diaries many warriors kept. These texts often used rain as a metaphor for transition, uncertainty, and the inevitability of change. Historians still debate whether samurai diaries should be read primarily as historical records or as artistic expressions meant to capture mood and atmosphere. Either way, the rain appears repeatedly, quietly shaping their stories and emotions. There's a charming detail: some samurai used small drops of rainwater to moisten their ink stones, believing it imparted a softer, more reflective quality to their writing. It's as if the rain itself joined them in recording their thoughts. Your companion slides open a scroll and begins reading an excerpt from a samurai's journal, describing a rainy morning spent watching the garden's bamboo leaves quiver and drip. The words flow slowly, deliberately, echoing the measured pace of the rain outside. You realize that the rain, so often a background presence, becomes the main character in these writings, the silent witness to moments of joy, sorrow, and quiet reflection. There's a subtle humor in how the samurai would complain about the inconvenience of rain, muddy roads, slippery armor, damp clothes, only to turn around and write beautiful verses about the very same weather. It's a reminder that even warriors could have complicated relationships with nature. As you listen, your companion explains that some samurai believed rain had a cleansing power, not just physically but spiritually. After a battle or a long journey, rain was seen as washing away the grime of war, renewing both land and soul. Historians still argue whether this belief was common among all samurai or particular to certain schools of thought, but it underlines the rain's symbolic weight. Your friend points to a small tea set arranged neatly on a low table. He describes the tradition of sharing tea during rainy days, a ritual meant to foster calm and connection, counterbalancing the harshness of the weather outside. There's an amusing story about a samurai who once nearly spilled his tea because he was too focused on composing a rain poem, much to the quiet amusement of his friends. It's a small, humanizing moment amid the discipline and formality. You sit beside the tea set, feeling the warmth of the cup seep into your hands, and your companion quotes a simple haiku about rain and tea, capturing the mingling of sensory pleasure and natural beauty. The rain outside begins to ease further, the pattering sound softening into a gentle whisper. You lean back and let the quiet fill you, the mingling sense of wet earth and brewed tea grounding you in the moment. The samurai's relationship with rain, you realize, is as complex and layered as the weather itself, sometimes a burden, sometimes a blessing, always a presence. The drizzle outside thins even more, leaving a delicate haze that wraps around the wooden beams of the house like a soft, translucent curtain. You and your samurai companion step outside again, this time toward the village outskirts where rain-soaked rice paddies stretch across the landscape like a vast, shimmering quilt. The air here smells rich and fertile, the faint hint of tilled earth mixing with the lingering moisture. Your companion tells you about the vital role of rain in samurai agricultural practices, not as warriors but as landowners and caretakers of the fields. Historians still debate how deeply samurai were involved in farming, but it's clear many managed estates where the timing and amount of rain could make or break a season's harvest. There's a quietly humorous detail that some samurai were less than enthusiastic about the mud and hard labor involved in tending to the fields, preferring poetry and swordsmanship instead. Yet, the survival of their families and communities depended on those very paddies. You walk slowly along a narrow earthen path between the flooded fields, water reflecting the gray sky like mirrors. Your companion points out the delicate young rice plants, swaying slightly with each breeze, their roots anchored firmly in the soaked soil. He explains that in poetry and ritual, rain was often seen as a symbol of fertility and renewal, a gift from the heavens that ensured life continued. Some samurai even held quiet ceremonies to pray for just enough rain. Not too much and not too little, to keep the balance. A fascinating tidbit: certain samurai clans maintained rain calendars, carefully recorded observations of rainy seasons and droughts, passed down through generations. These calendars helped predict agricultural cycles and informed when to plant and harvest. Historians still debate whether these records were more scientific or spiritual, but they demonstrate the blend of practical knowledge and reverence for nature typical of samurai life. As you continue, your companion points to small wooden stakes in the fields marked with faded inscriptions, ancient signs warning about flooding or promising protection from drought. These stakes were both practical markers and sacred talismans, illustrating the intersection of faith and farming. You can almost hear the quiet murmur of farmers, some of whom were samurai themselves, chatting under umbrellas, sharing stories about last year's rains and hoping for gentle showers to come. There's a gentle irony in this, considering how samurai are often imagined solely as fierce warriors. Here, in these quiet fields, they are custodians of life's rhythms, patiently waiting for the rain's slow dance to bring sustenance. Your companion then recounts a less-known legend of a samurai farmer who composed rain poems as a form of prayer, believing that each verse might coax the clouds into generosity. Historians still argue about the historical accuracy of this tale, but it beautifully captures the intimate bond between samurai, rain, and the earth. You take a deep breath, the cool, wet air filling your lungs, and feel the pulse of the rain reflected in the steady growth of those rice plants, quiet, persistent, and full of promise. The mist has lifted just enough for you to see distant mountains softened by the morning haze. You and your samurai companion follow a winding path toward a small village nestled between fields and forest. The ground beneath your feet is still damp, the scent of wet pine mingling with the fading scent of rain. Your guide begins to tell you about the daily routines of samurai during rainy seasons, a rhythm shaped by the weather's demands and the culture's expectations. While battles were rarely fought in storms, rainy days were far from idle. They involved maintenance, meditation, and quiet reflection. Historians still argue whether samurai preferred rainy days for training indoors or for stepping back and practicing restraint. The evidence suggests a mix, depending on the clan and individual temperament. There's a quaint detail: some samurai carried small, beautifully crafted rain hats called amigasa, made of woven straw, that not only shielded them from the rain but also made soft, rustling sounds as they moved, an unintended, gentle accompaniment to the pattering rain. You picture yourself walking softly through village streets, the sound of rain muffled by that hat's woven texture, feeling connected to the natural world in a subtle but persistent way. Your companion shares how samurai used rainy days to repair their armor and weapons, tasks requiring focus and patience. The rain slowed down the usual rush of activity, allowing attention to detail that might otherwise be missed. An interesting fact: in some regions, armor was treated with oil and lacquer to repel moisture, a painstaking process especially crucial during the rainy season. Historians still debate how effective these treatments were in the damp Japanese climate, but the effort underscores the constant battle between man, machine, and nature. As you walk deeper into the village, you hear the distant murmur of monks chanting, the sound blending with the soft drip of water from eaves and leaves. Rainy days were also prime times for meditation and poetry writing, moments of calm amidst the unpredictable world outside. Your companion tells a story of a samurai poet who would sit for hours by a window, watching raindrops race down the glass, composing verses inspired by the patterns they made. His poems rarely spoke of war but rather of the transient beauty captured in each drop's journey. There's a gentle humor in how some samurai were rumored to have preferred rainy days simply because it gave them an excuse to stay indoors. Sip tea, and avoid awkward social duties, a small rebellion against the rigid demands of their class. Historians still debate whether such anecdotes reflect real attitudes or playful exaggerations passed down through oral tradition, but they add a human warmth to the samurai image. You notice a cluster of paper lanterns hanging outside a tea house, their delicate paper surfaces mottled with rain stains. Your companion explains that rain could transform even simple objects into art, each droplet adding texture, depth, and life to otherwise ordinary scenes. As the clouds part slightly, you feel the quiet, steady presence of rain linger, not just as weather, but as a companion shaping the daily life of samurai. A soft percussion marking time's gentle passage. The afternoon sun begins to peek through thinning clouds, casting long, gentle shadows over the rain-dampened landscape. You stroll alongside your samurai companion toward a small shrine tucked away beneath towering cedar trees. The scent of wet wood and pine resin fills the air, calming and timeless. Your companion explains that rain held spiritual significance for samurai beyond its practical uses. It was a symbol of purification and renewal, deeply tied to Shinto rituals and beliefs. Rainwater collected from sacred springs was often used in cleansing ceremonies before battles or important events. Historians still debate how widely these rituals were practiced among the warrior class. But it's clear that many saw rain as a bridge between the earthly and divine. There's a quietly amusing detail. Some samurai believed that dancing in the rain could appease the gods and invite good fortune, though such behavior might have raised eyebrows among their more stoic peers. Imagine a samurai mid-sword practice suddenly breaking into a rain dance, nature's rhythm inspiring unexpected moves. You step into the shrine's courtyard, where stone lanterns glisten with droplets, and a small pool reflects the cloudy sky. Your companion tells you about the ancient practice of rain divination, where priests would interpret the timing and intensity of rainfalls as messages from the kami, or spirits. Certain rain patterns were considered omens, some promising prosperity, others cautioning patience or humility. Your guide shares a lesser-known tale of a samurai lord who famously interpreted a sudden downpour during a crucial negotiation as a sign to seek compromise rather than conflict. The story might be embellished, but it speaks to the deep respect samurai had for nature's subtle cues. The sun now shines softly through the scattered clouds, casting a warm glow over the landscape washed clean by rain. You and your samurai companion make your way back along the winding path, the air fresh and filled with the faint scent of moss and wet earth. Your companion reflects on the lasting legacy of samurai poetry about rain, how these quiet verses reveal a side of the warrior often hidden beneath armor and discipline, vulnerability, sensitivity, and a deep connection to the natural world. Historians still argue whether this poetic tradition was embraced by all samurai or mainly by a cultured elite. But its influence on Japanese literature and art is undeniable. You remember the slow drip of water from leaves, the rustling of straw hats, the soft glow of lanterns stained with rain, and the delicate verses that captured these fleeting moments. There's a comforting thought in how rain, often seen as a mere weather event, becomes a lens through which samurai viewed life's transient beauty and challenges. Your companion recounts a final, gentle story of a samurai who, after a lifetime of battles and duty, spent his final days writing rain poems in a quiet mountain retreat, finding peace in the very thing he once might have found inconvenient or frustrating. It's a reminder that even the fiercest warriors seek calm, that poetry and rain can soothe the soul in ways that swordplay never could. You pause to breathe deeply, the scent of wet pine and fresh rain filling your lungs, feeling the quiet pulse of the earth beneath your feet. Your companion smiles softly, noting how rain continues to inspire not just samurai poets but people everywhere, inviting them to slow down, reflect, and find beauty in the ordinary. As the light fades toward evening, you feel a gentle drowsiness creeping in, the rhythmic sounds of rain now a soft memory, lulling you toward rest. This journey through samurai rain poetry ends not with a clash of swords but with a whisper, an invitation to see the world through quieter, more tender eyes. You close your eyes and let the last drops of rain fade into your dreams.